Hello and welcome, everyone. If you are looking for baseball and the Postal Service teaching race and gender through two American institutions, the webinar, you are in the right place. Today, the Smithsonian Learning Lab team is joined by Jesse Aucoin and Jeremy Cantor of the National Postal Museum. I'll give you a sneak peek at them. They can wave and say hello. And so today they'll be walking us through some educational resources from the National Postal Museum. And right now, I'll also kind of give you a sneak peek of who you're hearing right now. My name is Ashley Naranjo. I am a manager of educator engagement here at the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. And I'll give you a sneak peek of the Learning Lab. I'll walk you through a little bit of a tour of it. And then we'll also see two collections specifically about this topic. And so really what's happened is the National Postal Museum has done a lot of the work for us. They've curated resources, artifacts, and added some essential questions to a really interesting and kind of compelling way of teaching about race and gender through the lens of both baseball as well as the USPS. So really excited to kind of dive right in. One of the things I wanted to mention is you too can ask questions of us. So I'm going to show you exactly how to do that here. So on your screen, to the right of your screen, you should see an area where there's a chat box, and I've tried to point it out here on the slide here. So you can see right now that we've got Matthew as well as Annie who've said hello. If you're with us as well, feel free to type in the chat and say hello. But then also throughout the session, at any time, if you have a question for our presenters, please feel free to ask it. And you can do so by just typing in the chat, and I'll interrupt them and I'll say, hey, we've got a great question from so-and-so. And so that's how we'll kind of move throughout the session. We want this to be useful to you. So it's certainly an interactive session as far as the ways that you can ask questions of us as well. We'll also be putting all of the links to any of the websites that we refer to throughout the session in that chat box too, so that you have access to that. I should mention too, if you are on Twitter and you're tweeting about your teaching experiences, please feel free to mention us. We're both at Smithsonian Lab, that's the Smithsonian Learning Lab, which you'll see a kind of peek of a little bit later in our session, as well as at Postal Museum. And if you haven't visited the Postal Museum before, it's a Smithsonian museum. It's one of 19 museums from across the institution, and really kind of interesting artifacts kind of beyond just what you might think of stamps. It's right, not on the National Mall, but right near the Union Station. So if you're in Washington, D.C., it's a great place to visit. There's actually an upcoming exhibition that Jesse's going to give us a little bit more information about, as well as kind of the more general education overview of what they do at the Postal Museum. After that, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what the Smithsonian Learning Lab is. We keep mentioning that. So I want to give you an overview of what's possible on this free digital platform. And then we'll go kind of into a deep dive with two specific collections that look at race and gender through the lenses of baseball as well as the Postal Service. I think these are really interesting and kind of unexpected ways of looking at these topics, and I think you'll find it really useful. So with that, I wanted to invite Jessie Aucoin. She is an educator at the National Postal Museum, and she's going to give us an overview of the National Postal Museum. Jessie?
Hi, thank you guys. I hope you guys can hear me. If you can't, please let Ashley know through the comments so that I can speak up, but I'm a little bit further away from the screen than I would otherwise if I wasn't sharing my space with Jeremy. So like Ashley said, I'm an educator for the National Postal Museum. I'm actually a former classroom teacher that transitioned into museum education about 12 years ago. And so I'm really happy to be able to use my experiences from the classroom and find a new lens through which to share them. So thank you for being my audience tonight. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what the National Postal Museum is, what we talk about, so that you guys can get excited about both our physical museum in hopes that you can come visit us, but also you can learn a little bit more about our opportunities online and the resources that we provide you so that if you can't physically come to the museum, you can still utilize what we have offering for you. As Ashley mentioned, we are part of the Smithsonian Institution, and we are, like she also said, downtown, right across the street from Union Station. Our museum is actually located in the historic post office for Washington, D.C., which was built in 1914 by architect Daniel Burnham. If you're familiar with the famous story Devil in the White City about Chicago during the Columbian Exposition, most of those buildings were built by Burnham. And if you're familiar with architecture, you'll see a lot of his unique touches in our building, as well as Union Station, which he designed. And they were both part of his intention to create a beautiful welcoming point, an access point to Washington, D.C. The museum occupies roughly 100,000 square feet of the building. We share it with another federal agency, and we have galleries and education spaces on 3 different floors throughout the space. Our collection, I would argue, is more unique than some of the other museums because of the fact that we talk about the post office and postal history, as well as stamps. But we also have a lot of unexpected variety and a lot of unexpected objects within them. As is the case with all Smithsonian museums, we are deemed what the federal government has deemed the nation's collection of stamps. Stamps we often refer to as philatelic. Philatelic or philately is anything stamp related. On the next slide, you'll see that we're also, we have a very niche collection that we work to try to connect to other subject areas. The very first piece of that collection was actually added or donated to the Smithsonian in 1886. And it was a panel of stamps that was housed in what was then just the National Museum. At that time, the Smithsonian was only one building. And that was actually, if you're familiar with the museums along the mall, the Arts and Industries building was the National Museum at that time. We also have the second largest collection in the Smithsonian. The Natural History Museum has the most, and they have a wonderful collection, do not get me wrong, but our collection is approximately 6 million objects. Being avid stamp collectors, as you can imagine, we have a lot of stamps, and each stamp is deemed an object, so we have quite a few of them. But if you think about it, stamps are also miniature pieces of art, and so we get an opportunity to interpret them as such. Stamps that highlight people, places, and events of importance throughout history. We also collect postal history, including the history of how mail moves, but also references to labor history, race and gender issues, the role of mail delivery in socioeconomic development, urban growth, and transportation, to name just a few. So we do cover a wide variety, which is one of the things that I really truly love about our collection. When it comes to stamps, we work to tell the entire story of stamps in our lives. And so we collect a variety of stamps, including rare stamps, thank you. Stamps such as the very first stamp ever created or ever issued, the penny black. Thank you. Totally blanked out. The penny black that was issued in the UK. The George Washington stamp, which is the first stamp issued here in the United States, and printing errors such as the inverted Jenny, where the plane is printed upside down. We also collect stamps that advocate for causes, such as the Sonoran Desert image that you see there is a series that advocated different climate zones and some of the dangers that they faced, or my personal favorite, the Adopt a Pet stamp issues. And as well as the breast cancer stamp issue, that there is the first what's called a semi-postal. That is actually a stamp that is charged or costs the purchaser more than the rate of postage, and the difference in price there is then typically donated to a charity cause, in this case, breast cancer research. We also collect stamps that are, of course, commemorative, things that commemorate important historic events, both nationally and internationally. And then we also collect things that we just find pretty. Arts and cultures, so artwork, humanities, and then just beautiful topography, examples of beautiful topography. In addition to collecting what goes on stamps, we also like to interpret and collect how the stamps are produced, ranging from the etchings that are used to make pressings through print presses, such as the Snyder press, which we do demonstrations on. So you can see the production of an individual stamp as well as an entire sheet of 100+ stamps. Beyond the stamps, we have a total of 14 gallery spaces in the museum where we also talk about US stamps, international stamps, rotating exhibits, stamp art, and then the history of the Postal Service. So this is where I think some people sometimes are surprised at the variety that our collection houses. When it comes to the postal history side of things, we have an exhibition called Moving the Mail that talks about the variety of transportation methods that have been used to deliver mail, including planes, trains, and of course, automobiles, or the precursor to the automobile as the stagecoach may be. We also like to show some of the more unexpected or unique modes of transportation, including dog sleds that were used in the far north, the mailster, which is one of my favorites as well. As you can see, it's a very adorable design from the 1960s that went out of fashion due to its, I will say, ineffectiveness. It had a tendency to topple over due to poor center of gravity with the 3 wheels, but lovely to look at, certainly. And then the pneumatic tube system, which was an underground tube system used in large cities such as New York, that used pneumatic tubing like you find at your bank drive-up window to push mail through in canisters. And it's a little hard to see on that map, but there are some red lines that show some new tubing that was being installed in Manhattan. Our Mail Marks History Gallery and exhibit is arguably my favorite because it does show that wide variety and how we can connect our collections and postal history to kind of the greater history of the world, including the letter from the Silk Road of 1360, a paddle, that was used to input holes in letters that were then fumigated in an attempt to combat yellow fever. It did not work, for the record. We also have Amelia Earhart's flight suit. She, like many other aviators of her time, had a contract with the Postal Service to help deliver mail. She was also an avid stamp collector, so we're big fans of Amelia Earhart around the Postal Museum. On the bottom left, you'll see a card that says Titanic. What many people forget is that the full name of the ship was the RMS Titanic, RMS standing for Royal Mail Ship. And so there was a number of letter carriers on the ship, and this was actually collected from the jacket pocket of one letter carrier when his body was discovered. And then in the top right, this is a really touching piece. In 2002, Congress passed Public Law 107-117, which was the directive for the Smithsonian Institution to collect objects related to September 11th. So this particular piece was actually recovered from a mail carton from the United Airlines Flight 93 crash site in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, as part of one of our greater displays that we have that include objects from the Church Street Post Office in Manhattan, which is just a couple blocks away from the Twin Towers. So it's a really poignant reminder of kind of how the Postal Service and postal history has kind of entwined its way, into our history and our lives from the very beginning. Another unexpected gallery for many people is our Behind the Badge exhibition. This is our exhibit that highlights the United States Postal Inspection Service, which is the oldest federal law enforcement agency in existence. Postal inspectors investigate mail fraud and mail crimes, as well as crimes committed to postal employees. And so they do a variety of things such as mail fraud, or as you guys can see on the far right there, those are stamps that are fraudulent stamps, so printing of fraudulent stamps. The far left is actually the remains of a post mailbox that was damaged in an EF5 tornado. And so it's their duty then to try to identify what pieces of mail were in that and try to track down the senders as well as the receivers to let them know that their mail will not be delivered. Because of course it isn't very important to deliver the mail. And then my favorite piece on this particular slide is that letter in the center there. As many of you guys may remember, shortly after September 11th, we had a series of envelopes mailed with anthrax, including 7 known ones. This one is the envelope that was actually that was actually sent to Senator Tom Daschle that contained anthrax. And so it's very heavily smudged due to the chemical process that the irradiation treatments was used on the envelopes. For those that don't remember, though, just as a quick reminder, the mail that was being processed that had the anthrax in it, it did go through a lot of the local DC post offices. and a total of 22 people suffered from anthrax contamination, 5 of whom died. And so it's a really important moment in postal history. The Tommy gun, just because Tommy guns are fun in to look at, is not because people use them to rob post offices, though I'm sure they certainly did in the 1920s. It's more because I think a lot of people don't realize that not just Al Capone had them, but that these were standard issue to postal inspectors in the 1920s because they needed to protect the post offices. All right, so that's our museum kind of in broad scope. As Ashley mentioned, we do have an upcoming exhibit that will be opening next year in April of 2020 about baseball. It's called Baseball, America's Home Run. So we will be using a lot of these variety of objects that I've just kind of highlighted to you and these unique approaches to history and postal history and tying those into baseball. Jeremy will be talking in a little bit about our Learning Lab collections that we've used as a starter to kind of get that ball rolling and that conversation started. But in the meantime, I wanted to also let you guys know about our department, the Education Visitor Services Department. So, obviously the museum works to preserve and interpret these objects, and then it's our job to help further interpret that for the visitors of the museum. And so we like to make them accessible through public programs and activities. As a school programs coordinator, I focus exclusively on students and teachers. Anytime student groups come to the museum for a facilitated program, I coordinate that and lead that myself, teacher workshops such as now. But we have a variety of events and activities going on in the museum every day, from Play Corner, which is the picture in the bottom right corner, to holiday card workshops, such as the top right corner, where people are invited to kind of learn more about the items that we can use in the mail as a way of continually reminding people of the role that the mail has had in our lives. If you want to bring your students to the museum, we offer programming for students pre-K through 5th grade at no cost. If you visit our website, you can see on the next slide, you'll see we have a website, a page of our website dedicated to our facilitated program opportunities for you to look through, see if anything is of interest to you. We also do have a number of online resources, curriculum packets, activity guides for students of all ages. But our big thing that we're really starting to move forward into more is Learning Lab. It's a really great opportunity to create targeted collections that work for you and your students, and it gives you a lot of variety, which is why we would like Jeremy to kind of walk you through some examples that we've put together so you can see just how broad of a collection you can create through Learning Lab. Yeah. So I'm going to hand it over to Jerry, unless Ashley has some stuff she wants to add.
Absolutely, yes. Well, thanks so much, Jessie, for sharing kind of the secrets of the National Postal Museum. I think most people think of it at first as, oh, well, am I just going to see stamps? And actually, it's so much more than that. There's a ton of artifacts that you just saw that can be used across disciplines, too. I think one of the unique things about the National Postal Museum is it's not just a history museum or an art museum or a science museum. It's kind of all of those things combined. And I think even some of the applications that Jeremy's going to tell us about even bring in math as well as contemporary events too. So it's really exciting to hear about the upcoming exhibition with baseball. I think that's also something that's kind of unexpected, but a nice hook for students as they're thinking about race and gender. So very grateful to you, Jessie, for kind of sharing those secrets of the museum. I wanted to remind folks too that as you're coming into the webinar, this is a webinar that's actually going to be archived, and it's going to be archived at the same exact link. So if you want to refer back to this, oh, what did Jessie say about that one object? You can always just on the same link, you can actually access this almost immediately after we're finished this evening. So I wanted to mention that. You can also share it with a friend if there's something that you think would be especially useful to a colleague. With that, I'm going to give you a short overview of what the Smithsonian Learning Lab is, and then Jeremy from the National Postal Museum is going to give us an overview of two specific collections that look at race and gender, and specifically through the lens of both baseball as well as the Postal Service too. So with that, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the Learning Lab, and we'll just pull that up on the screen for just a second here. Bear with me. All right. So the Smithsonian Learning Lab. So now on your screen, you should see the homepage for the Smithsonian Learning Lab. The URL is also in the chat box to the right of the screen. And here's where you can access all of the Smithsonian's digital content. So that's everything from stamps, like Jesse mentioned, to specimen from natural history, to artifacts from American history, portraits, artworks, etc. All of those digitized resources are available to you for free and accessible here on the Smithsonian Learning Lab. But it's more than just those specific resources. So I kind of want to walk you through real quick what you can find on the Learning Lab. So if you click on Discover, it'll bring you down to this page here. And again, like I said, there's millions of Smithsonian resources. There's images, there's recordings, and by that I mean there's podcasts. There's also sound recordings as well from our Folkways recording studio. There's also text, and text means, you know, diaries and letters, primary sources for sure, but also great blog posts by educators from across the institution that really serve as a good model for contextual information. There's also videos. And like I said, too, similar to the Postal Museum, the Smithsonian's collection is really interdisciplinary. We've got collections in history, art, culture, and the sciences. And what's interesting about all of these individual objects is through the Learning Lab, you can actually aggregate these resources into collections. And like I said, in just a second, Jeremy will walk us through two specific collections that utilize the National Postal Museum's collections, as well as some of the other museums across the Smithsonian too. So stay tuned for that for sure. So again, there's resources that you can find, but then also collections that are pre-made. Anyone can make a collection. So not only museum educators like the three of us, but you can also, teachers, students can actually make collections too. And so when you go into create, you can see all the possibilities. Not only can you kind of put all of these resources into a folder, but you can also add quiz questions. You could add image hotspots to point out specific details. You could also take someone else's collection, let's say, and kind of remix it or adapt it to meet the needs of your students too. So lots of great features here in the Learning Lab as far as just taking resources, building them to create collections of your own resources for your students. And then that last piece is, of course, share. So you can publish your collections so that they're searchable in the Smithsonian Learning Lab. So another teacher who's teaching the same topics that you are can find your great lesson and use it with their students. You can also embed it. So you could take a little bit of HTML code. It's pretty easy to do, and actually have it live on your own blog or teacher website. And then, of course, you can share via social media and use some of the tools within the Learning Lab to assign to a roster. Like I said, if you have any questions throughout this whole session, feel free to write us in the chat box. The last piece, too, is learn. And so we have kind of a growing community of Learning Lab users, teachers, museum educators, folks that are trying to use artifacts and primary sources in the classroom. So we also have a blog. So as you're kind of going through and you might be interested in some kind of mini case studies of how teachers are using these resources in the classroom, that's a great place to check out. Once you sign up, you'll actually also receive a Bright Ideas newsletter. And that's just a great reminder, too, of kind of new and exciting resources that come out just about every 2 to 3 weeks. And then finally, similar to today's webinar that you're joining us for, we also have some upcoming webinars. We have one specifically with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's a deep dive into their collections. So you can go ahead and click on that link to register for your next webinar with us. And then also we have online office hours that we host every Tuesday, just about every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So if you are kind of trying to figure out how to get started with the Learning Lab or need help finding a resource, you can just click on each of these links on Tuesday at 4, and someone from the Smithsonian Learning Lab team will kind of walk you through any questions that you might have too. With that, I wanted to go ahead and take a peek at the two collections that Jeremy has created for us and curated. If we did a search, let's say, for baseball, and as I type that in, you'll see we have tons of resources here in this tab. You can also refine your search to say, just show me images or just show me videos. You can actually refine your search to also say, I only want to see things, let's say, from the Postal Museum. So we'll do that. And that also refines my search to specifically, here we have some stamps, we have a blog post, all sorts of great resources that you can find here in the Learning Lab. But the other tab here that you'll notice is Learning Lab Collections. And this is a great place to find pre-curated aggregations and groupings of resources. So the two collections we're going to look at today, one is about women in baseball in the post office, and the other one is about segregation, integration, and the civil rights movement in both baseball and the post office. So with that, I wanted to introduce an educator that's been working here on these collections for you all. Jeremy?
Hi, everyone. Like Jesse, I'm also a former classroom teacher, so I'm really excited to share these collections with you. Before I kind of dive into the collections themselves, I kind of wanted to give an overview of why baseball and the Postal Service, maybe with our exhibit and with these collections as well. And so, as you can see, and as Ashley has shown with her search for Baseball and Learning Lab, we in our collection have a collection of baseball stamp series, baseball stamp art that relate to legendary playing fields, to legends of baseball, to the Negro Leagues. And those are kind of going to be the center pieces of our upcoming exhibit, from which we'll branch out and talk about a number of other issues and have a number of other objects as well. And we kind of have a mantra at the Post Museum of every stamp tells a story. And so with that mantra, part of what we do in the education department is we use the stamps, use the objects in our collection to talk about not only the history of that stamp, but also how that object or how that stamp contextualizes American history. And so that's kind of what we're doing with these collections and with our upcoming exhibit as well. Kind of going into the general why then of why we did these two collections, other than the fact that we have an upcoming baseball exhibit, is that with our collection, both postal history and also our philatelic collection, our collection of stamps, was really a great opportunity to use these two institutions of baseball and the Postal Service to talk about two really important issues in American history, especially as they're relevant to DC, Maryland, and Virginia area fifth graders, which would be the civil rights movement and then gender equality or the women's rights movement. I'm going to talk a bit about kind of logistics of the collections. There are multiple Learning Lab collections can serve multiple purposes. So with this one right here, Segregation, Integration, and the Civil Rights Movement, I believe that this one, the end user is the teacher. So, and as Ashley is showing you with the little eye icon in the top right corner, you can learn a little bit more about the collection. And so on the bottom there, it'll say end user is the teacher instructor. And so with these collections where the end user is the teacher, the collection doesn't have a specific activity necessarily associated with it. It might not have a specific essential question. It's really more a collection of artifacts for the teacher to implement in their classroom however they see fit. There's a notes to other users section where there will be supporting questions to scaffold inquiry. There might be an activity idea. There are more suggestions than anything else. And there's also some state standards or Common Core standards that are relevant to that collection as well.
Jeremy, I wanted to mention too, to our folks that are listening at home, I just included the Learning Lab link to this specific collection in the chat box. So that's something that you can refer back to if you're interested in using this in your classroom. It's kind of, ready to go. It's a lot of resources that have already been curated. You can see that there's those supporting questions there, as well as some activity ideas and ways that it connects to the standards, which I know is so important for teachers. So as you're looking through it, feel free to kind of take a peek at how you might use this in the classroom. And if you've got ideas, feel free to include them in the chat, and we'll share those with folks aloud too. So, but Jeremy's going to give us a tour of what those resources are that we're talking about within this collection.
Absolutely. And before we dig into this collection, I also would like to mention that Learning Lab really lends itself well to differentiation in the classroom. So if based on where your students are and wanting to meet your students, if there are certain questions that lend themselves better to one group of students and there are certain activities that lend themselves better to another, that's certainly doable. As Ashley said, these collections, they're not static. There are opportunities for teachers to edit them and manipulate them to meet their needs and the needs of their students. And so if there are opportunities or ways that, this collection could be altered to best fit your classroom, that's always encouraged, and differentiation opportunities in there as well. So kind of diving into this collection, the teacher is the end user in this collection. And so this collection really hopefully assists teachers in examining the issues of segregation and integration, primarily as it relates to the African-American experience in these two institutions. And so there are artifacts, there are articles, there are videos in this collection that hopefully will allow students to understand these issues in more nuanced ways. I think it's the value of these objects in particular, and part of the reasoning behind choosing some of them was that provides kind of a nice gap between the passing of the 15th Amendment and then kind of the civil rights movement, as a lot of us learned it in school with Brown v. Board in 1954, and kind of talks about some of the things going on at the turn of the century and prior to that. So again, providing hopefully a more nuanced understanding of these issues through these two institutions. I'll briefly outline the flow of these collections. As you can see, after the opening stamp, it looks like gray lines. But there is an essential question here. How did segregation, integration, and the civil rights movement at large manifest themselves in Major League Baseball and the Postal Service, and in what ways these manifestations were similar and or different in both institutions? Again, given that the teacher is the end user here, that's a recommended essential question, but obviously up to you to come up with whichever one you think is most appropriate. From there, these artifacts dive into baseball players and teams. So there's photographs, stamps, and then some objects from other Smithsonian institutions as well. So not all the artifacts in this collection are from our collection at the Postal Museum, though many are. Learning Lab is such a great resource because we can pull from all the different Smithsonian institutions and include all those artifacts to create a truly holistic collection. From there, we move into baseball and art to explore the diverging ways that white and black ball players were depicted in art, helping to underscore, hopefully, how prejudice and stereotypes infiltrated the arts as well as Major League Baseball. And then from there, we examine issues of segregation, integration, and civil rights movement in the Postal Service. And then it ends with 2 videos for class discussion. Again, I think in the description to the collection, there are recommended timestamps for abbreviated viewings of the video, so that I realize that it's a long video, so there might not be time to watch all of it. Right there are having students watch from the 3:09 to 9:54 mark. So that was kind of the recommended timestamp, but if there's time to watch all of it, there's time to watch all of it, and if not, that's the recommended viewing time. And then there were some artifacts that I wanted to highlight in this collection to kind of illuminate how Learning Lab can be used. The first one is that, not the first Jackie Robinson stamp, but the second one right there, which is actually the first he's the first baseball player to be depicted on a stamp, and this stamp was issued in 1982. And so what I'll highlight here first is that the reasoning behind choosing a lot of these artifacts is not only the object itself, but also the description, which can be found in the top left corner in the eye icon. And this one doesn't have much of a description, but it does highlight the date of issue. And so, I think that there could be a really great discussion about, well, why is Jackie Robinson the first player that we choose to memorialize on a stamp? You have Babe Ruth and Ted Williams and all these legends of baseball who will be memorialized later on, but Jackie Robinson is the first. And so I think that is particularly interesting and worthy of discussion. And then another artifact that I'd like to highlight in its collection is that image on the left of Robinson at an SCLC convention with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the reason why I found this image particularly powerful and included it in the collection is to highlight, Robinson, we know him for breaking the color barrier, but his actions, really are in the larger scope of the civil rights movement. It's not an isolated incident, and that the civil rights movement is something that had been happening for years and years and years, not just in the 50s and 60s. And I think that the image also lends itself well to contextualize athletes and protests. I'm sure that these issues, Colin Kaepernick, for example, come up in the classroom, and so this is a great opportunity to contextualize these kind of protests, with athletes in the sports world, with larger political movements have been happening for a really long time. Robinson, Muhammad Ali, and now Colin Kaepernick. So I found this image particularly powerful, and that's kind of why it is included in the collection. And then the last image I'd like to highlight is that image of Postmaster Burleson, now moving into kind of postal history. And he was a postmaster during the early 20th century, around the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. And he advocated for the segregation of the postal service and postal labor unions, as you see in the description there. And so, and Woodrow Wilson actually also encouraged it. He had no problem with Burleson wanting segregation in these postal labor unions. And so, again, this is an artifact that really highlights the ubiquity and widespread nature of prejudice and segregation, not just in the South, but nationwide. The Postal Service obviously is a nationwide institution, and so I found this artifact particularly powerful in that sense of really highlighting the nationwide impact of segregation. And as you saw earlier, there are additional questions kind of in the notes to other users section of this collection that hopefully can highlight further things or help students dive into these artifacts and these issues on a deeper level. Again, they're for your use as you see fit. And so if there are no questions, we can move on to the other collection on women, on gender equality and the women's collection.
Sure. So if you're just joining us, I just wanted to remind folks on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a chat bar and you'll see, I think Smithsonian Education has written in, Matthew and Annie have also written in, but feel free to ask questions of our presenters. They're happy to answer any questions that you have. Thus far, we've gotten a kind of an overview of the National Postal Museum and all of their offerings beyond kind of simply the stamps. But also using stamps as kind of primary sources too, as mini artworks, as stories that are kind of telling specific moments in history. Then also Jeremy has walked us through our first collection of the evening, Segregation, Integration, and the Civil Rights Movements, but through the lenses of both baseball and the U.S. Postal Service, which again seem like unlikely kind of hooks, but really as you dig in deeper, I love the way that he's kind of contextualize this for us as kind of this was going on nationwide. And so looking at specifically the Jackie Robinson stamp, for example, we also saw a great photograph of the SCLC, as well as a portrait of the Postmaster General at the time, who actually had advocated for segregation. So again, kind of looking at all of these different artifacts and different resources and ways to really hook kids as far as kind of diving really deep into these conversations. I also loved that contemporary connection to athletes and activism, Jeremy. So important and kind of interesting for students to see that there's, this has been going on for decades and there's ties to today too. We do have a few questions in the chat box too, so feel free to add your questions and we'll address them kind of in an order. But the first question says, this looks like a great collection. If I find other stuff on Learning Lab, can I add to your collection or do I need to make my own? So Jeremy, do you want to give us a little overview of how we would do that, how we would make this our own?
Right, absolutely. So once you create an account, actually, if you go back to the broad Learning Lab and type in baseball as you did before to bring up the collections, there's actually a perfect example of this. So if you go to Learning Lab collections, you'll notice that there are 2 images of that woman on a stamp because someone else, Jessica Rosenberry, took the collection that we created and then edited it for her purposes as well. So once you create an account in Learning Lab, you can take one of the pre-created collections and then edit it and alter it as you see fit, add to it if you want. It's really just kind of once you have that account. And if Ashley, if there's anything you want to add on that front, please feel free.
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, you can kind of take a peek at this. This is a sneak peek of the next collection we'll be talking about. But once you have an account, it's very easy to just simply make a copy over here in the right-hand menu. And then you can start to reorder, delete, add to a collection. And what's nice about that is there's always kind of this, what I call a cookie crumb trail. So folks can see other copies of their collections. And the copies also always refer back to, here, I actually copied one but didn't publish it. But here, Jessica's copy, we can see when we click into that, we can also see that it's been adapted from Jeremy's original through the National Postal Museum. So just a quick kind of, way to be able to make sure that credit is given where credit's due, but then also allowing you to kind of make it your own, make adjustments to the collections yourself too. So great question, Matthew. There's also a follow-up question too, and I'll go back to the specific collection that it's referring to. And here we were looking at segregation, integration, and the civil rights movements. And down at the bottom, an eagle-eyed viewer noticed, he says, what is that green book down there? Is it related to the movie? So we certainly want to point out this artifact. It's from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Jeremy, do you want to give us a little kind of overview of what this is and how it's related to the collection?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you'll go into, again, the description of this specific artifact in that kind of top left corner, you'll read that, the Green Book provided travelers with information for African American travelers so that as they went into the South of, what were safe spaces, safe restaurants, et cetera. And it was created by a postal worker. And so that's why this is in the collection. It is definitely a connection to what our mission is, and because of that, we wanted to highlight it, talking about how from a postal perspective, the postal services kind of positive impact in aiding African Americans as they navigated the segregated South.
This is also one of those great resources that actually has several images. So you'll notice in the bottom right, it says, 3 out of 27 images. So you can also kind of, scroll through and see what it looked like inside. The way that it's been digitized is really interesting to be able to kind of scroll through. It also mentions, please mention the Green Book as you're going to each of these sites. It's got beauty parlors and taverns. So a really interesting artifact. And I love the connections to this collection as well. And also something that students might be familiar with too, but want to kind of see a real one, on the screen too. So really interesting. And And thanks for the questions. If other folks have questions, please feel free to include them in the chat box to the right of your screen. Especially if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to participate in the chat. Without further ado, I want to also give us a little bit of time to look at our next collection. Our next collection is Women in Baseball. And I'll just go right here. So Women in Baseball and the Post Office. So Jeremy, you want to give us a little overview of this collection and a tour of what we're seeing here?
Yeah, I'll quickly go through this one as well. As with the other one, the teacher was the end user. In this one, the student is the end user, which means that there's a more directed essential question and more directed specific activity to go along with it. Hopefully, the idea with these kind of student-driven, where the student's the end user with these collections, is that there's quicker implementation in the classroom. However, again, like with the last collection, it is adaptable. It is up for you as a teacher to interpret and change and edit as you see fit. Again, suggestions, but if you like the specific activity, if you like the essential question, it's meant for kind of quicker implementation in the classroom.
And for folks that are following along at home, I've also included the URL in the chat box too, so that you can refer back to it, both for your own teaching. Maybe you want to kind of take a peek at some of the artifacts that Jeremy's curated for us. He's done a lot of the heavy lifting too, so this is really great to see the ways that he's used some of these artifacts and these essential questions to really help kids start to kind of increase their critical thinking, and make connections to these kind of two major U.S. institutions. So I've really kind of loved looking through some of these collections. Do you want to give us a little bit of a tour of this one, Jeremy?
Absolutely. So there's also some artifacts that I would love to highlight in this one. To start, I'll give again kind of the flow of the collection. It starts with baseball players and teams, really focusing on kind of the historical access that women have had to playing professional baseball, how issues of gender inequality have manifested themselves in baseball. I think, myself, I'm an avid baseball fan. I didn't realize that women had actually played professional baseball in the Negro Leagues. And so there's some images and some articles about kind of the women who play professional Negro League baseball. And then there's also references to the African-American or the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, as seen in the very great movie, A League of Their Own. And then from there, we go into how the U.S. postal workers and explore kind of the gender inequality, how it impacted the United States Postal Service and the historical access that women have had to those jobs. And finally, kind of in the last collection, we looked at some art pieces. As Jesse said, stamps, they have a use themselves, but they're also kind of small pieces of art. And so using these stamps, looking at them and analyzing them through an artistic lens, thinking about the diverging ways that women have been depicted on USPS postage, and the kind of what stereotypes have been reinforced or not. So there are a few artifacts.
Jeremy, I wonder too, seeing these stamps kind of in this order that you've laid them out, it's kind of interesting because to me, they almost seem like mini time capsules too. You can kind of almost guess what are the more modern ones and what are the more kind of traditional roles that women have played. Could you speak a little bit about kind of the order that you chose and how someone might use that in the classroom?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. So I ordered these in a specific way, as Ashley mentioned, and my thinking on it was kind of almost historically chronological, not chronological by the date of issue. If you actually go into each stamp, you'll notice that they are not ordered by their date of issue. So this one, for example, Women in the Armed Forces single, was issued in 1952. But then there are some later that were issued before that. My thinking in this ordering was more historically chronological, going from suffrage to the war, the We Can Do It, Rosie the Riveter, and then into kind of the more classic stereotype domesticated images of women, or as teachers, and then from there, kind of a shift into more modern portrayals of women in athletics, and these are the Centennial Olympic Games stamps, as you can see. So softball and then also track and field. So that was my thinking, but then again, as we've been mentioning, Learning Lab is flexible. And so if you find a better way to order those, or if you think that there's a certain chronology that makes more sense, absolutely, that's your opportunity to change and mess with it as you see fit.
We also have another question about these stamps too, that I should mention. We ask, how are subjects chosen for stamps?
Can I take that one?
Go for it, Jessica.
Okay. So it's actually a really interesting and unique process. There's an entire committee called CSAC that works for the Postal Service. CSAC standing for Citizen Stamp Advisory Council. It might be committee. I can never remember what the final C stands for. Forgive me. But they receive suggestions and ideas and nominations, if you will, from anyone in the country. Any citizen can suggest a stamp. They receive an average of about 30,000 stamp suggestions each year. And then they go through each of those suggestions and they whittle down based on a couple of rules and expectations of what they should be kind of adhering to. All stamps need to portray a person, a place, an event, or a thing, which is, of course, most everything. But then they also have to meet certain standards, things like portraying America in a positive light, of widespread national appeal, things that kind of make sure that they are American or American related, because of course these are stamps that are going to be traveling around the world promoting kind of our country and things that our culture finds important and are of value. So CSAC goes through all of those submissions, and then from there, kind of cross-referencing with important anniversary dates that are coming up and whatnot, they whittle it down to about 20 to 25 a year that they actually choose to issue. And from there, then they work with stamp artists to draft the design and figure out exactly the graphic layout of how the stamp will be portrayed and then issued from there. The whole process takes an average of 2 to 3 years. So it's a very lengthy process, but a fascinating one if you're interested in stamp art at all.
Absolutely. That sounds great. Again, just a reminder, if you have other questions, we have just about 10 minutes left. So I wanted to make sure, as you've been listening to this, are there ideas that are kind of running through your head? How you might use these resources in the classroom, how you already teach race and gender, any great tips for other teachers that are just getting started, how you might think baseball might be a hook for your students. Is this something that you might use in the classroom? So feel free to type in the chat if you have any of the ideas about any of those things or have a question for our presenters. We'd be happy to have you answer they'd be happy to answer those questions for you. With that, I want to also give Jeremy some time to kind of just go through a few of these artifacts because some of them are kind of catching my eye. Jeremy, are there any that you want to kind of mention specifically?
Yeah, with the time allotted, there's one more that I'd like to highlight, and that is the little bronze, it looks like a bronze tag of sorts on the bottom there. And there's a little bit more than meets the eye with this one, and it's again an example of why sometimes the reason we include artifacts is not just for the image but for the description. And if you go to the description, you'll see the title. It says U.S. Post Office Department, Washington D.C. Oni Tag. And if you have not heard of who Oni is, Oni was a dog who lived during the late 19th century, and he is the official, what was like the official mascot of the Postal Service at that time. Unofficial, excuse me, unofficial mascot. He would travel with postal workers and to all the different towns that he would go to. Many times he would receive tags like this one. And the reason why we chose this tag along with Oni, who, if you happen to visit the Postal Museum, he is actually on display in the museum. He is taxidermied. And according to
Washington Express,
okay,
they have deemed him the best example of taxidermy in DC. So we are quite proud of our own.
But even more than Oni, although he is wonderful, the reason why I wanted to highlight this specific artifact is because it does talk about the women and the men who were working in the Postal Service at this time. It talks about how there were 120 men, 110 women who were working in this Washington, D.C. repair shop. But then it really dives into what the women, the work the women did. They were, sewing a lot of the canvas sacks, but it also highlights their pay, which was, as you can see, 3.5 cents per bag. And I think that this is a great opportunity, or this artifact is a great opportunity to talk about how Learning Lab can also be a place for cross-curricular work. This can be a math problem, which I did. When you do the math, if you average a 6-day or assume a 6-day work week, that's about $8 a week. It's around $32 a month, and the men received $75 a month. Which, so not only does this artifact highlight kind of the pay gap and the pay inequality between men and women at the time, again, also an opportunity for some cross-curricular multiplication work.
Add contemporary issues as well, with the pay gap still being in existence.
Absolutely.
I have to say it.
Absolutely. And again, an opportunity to make it relevant. So that's for all these reasons. I thought this artifact was really poignant, actually.
Absolutely. It's super intriguing. And I think as students are able to kind of say, hey, wait a minute, what's this, artifact that I'm seeing here, and start to kind of uncover these stories, I think history really comes alive as they're asking those good inquiry questions and trying to kind of make connections across some of these things that they're learning about. So I really appreciate that artifact, but also kind of the way you've curated this to really hook students to this topic from a variety of different perspectives. I think that's really kind of the power of this collection specifically, as well as some of the other ones that the National Postal Museum has created. With that, I also wanted to open it up to any further questions from any of our participants. So if you have a question, we have just about 3 more minutes left. So feel free to type it in the chat. Don't be shy. This is the moment to ask your question. So if you've got a question, our presenters would be happy to answer it. I also wanted to remind you that we have office hours every Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And so if you're interested in office hours, we can also help you with, choosing the right resource. And we also have an upcoming webinar on March 19th with our friends from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So all of those PD events are here on our website. They're listed here. I just wanted to mention too, we have a note from Susanna who's been watching, and she said, another great webinar. Thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate the way it's geared towards student use. So thanks, Susanna, for chiming in. I really appreciate kind of your feedback as far as you've been seeing these collections. Would love to hear, if you have feedback as you're using them in your classroom, please just drop us a note. I should mention on every single page of the Learning Lab, so we mean it, in the bottom right, there is this blue question mark. And when you click on the blue question mark, you can actually submit feedback directly to us. So you just type in your email address and type in a message, and we'll make sure it either gets to Jesse or Jeremy, or if it's a question specifically about the Learning Lab, it'll make its way to me, I bet. So feel free to share feedback as you're using these resources in the classroom. One final question. We have just about another minute, but we have one other question. It says, where can I find stamps to use in the classroom? Great
question. If you're looking for stamps that have been what's called canceled, meaning they've been used already and are no longer eligible to be used for actually mailing your post or your envelopes, you can actually buy some online on eBay or in various other online retailers. We sell some by the bag in our gift store, but I would argue the best way to get them is to come to the museum itself. We have a stamp collecting table during all of our open hours where you can dig through piles of stamps and you can actually start your own collection, taking away, I believe it's up to 6 stamps at a time, so you can make thematic collections or just whatever you find pretty to get you thinking about it a little bit more. And if you're really interested, certainly by all means, you can reach out to us directly and we can help coordinate something beyond just 6 stamps.
Excellent. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank our participants for their great questions. I want to thank our presenters, too, from the National Postal Museum for not only curating these collections for us, helping us think in different ways, but also sharing their work here tonight with us. Like I mentioned, this session will be archived, so you can refer back to it whenever you need to. And please join us for our next webinar, March 19th. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.